Well, we're all a little earlier here today. It's good to see you. It's still kind of daylight. Sun's just starting to set. Got the fire going. You have to be careful with it nowadays, you know. Got a smaller fire. Well, it doesn't matter really, as hot as it is. The important part is just being around our friends and family and old timers and telling stories. And that's what we're doing. That's what we're gonna do tonight, no doubt. So I got me a cup of joe here to help me keep my throat well. And I know you got something. I look around and I see most people have a thermos or something going on. Now this is a story sent in by one of our listeners. You know, we've read a few of those lately. Sure like to read yours. And if you're sitting on a story and you just haven't gotten motivated enough to send it in yet, well, you just go ahead and do that. Now's the time. We'd love to hear it. This one here is about a Bigfoot encounter, and the listener that sent it in calls it a night of fear. And here it is. Well, I was in Northern California when this happened, not far from the Desolation Wilderness. That's a place known for its Bigfoot encounters. I often went camping by myself, even though as a single woman in my 50s, many of my friends thought I was crazy. I had a small tent, camp chair, Coleman cook stove, everything else I needed to comfortably camp out for a long weekend. It was my favorite way to spend my days off. I had 2 young Australian shepherds as my constant companions, and although I joked that my dogs would probably lick someone to death rather than actually protect me against an intruder to my camp, well, they did serve as a bit of a deterrent for bears and other wild animals, keep them from entering my camp. I preferred camping in the complete wilderness, away from everyone. Campgrounds were just too crowded for my taste, too much noise, too many people, too many large RVs coming and going at all hours of the day and night. So I stayed away from established campsites and found my own remote camping spots. I didn't carry a gun with me, not that I would have anything against them. I just never learned to shoot one. I had a small can of pepper spray, and well, I'd never had to use that either. I just never had any uncomfortable run-ins with people or animals in all the many years I'd been camping. So I guess I had a naive sense of confidence. Well, this particular campsite that I was in was far from any established road, off in the remote forest wilderness. Had a beautiful little stream nearby, and my tent was pitched under a canopy of tall cedar and Doug fir. My camp faced a large meadow filled with purple lupin, red Indian paintbrush, and yellow sunflowers. It was just gorgeous. Now, on the night of the encounter, I built a campfire and cooked campfire stew. Maybe you know what that is. It's a mix of hamburger, onions, and carrots, rolled up in tinfoil and throw them down into the coals. I always put a little salt, pepper, and maybe a little garlic in with mine. A recipe from the old Girl Scout days. It was dark, and a million stars littered the sky with the Milky Way arching above. I sat beside the dying embers in my camp chair, sipping a cup of hot coffee with a good dash of Irish cream, when I heard the strangest noise. Far off in the distance, I heard what sounded like a woman's scream. Well, I knew from experience it must just be a mountain lion. I'd heard that once before, and I knew them to sound very human-like. But this time, it was followed by a very masculine call, a sort of a roaring ah sound that did not sound the least bit familiar. It made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. I strained my ears, listening for the slightest sound of twigs breaking, which would indicate that whatever it was coming towards me. After a minute or two, it happened again. The scream-like sound followed by that deep-sounding roar. Again I sat, straining my ears, listening for more and feeling my heart beating wildly in my chest. I whispered to my dogs to come closer. They had both alerted to the sound, and they were lying just a few feet away. Their ears were pricked straight up. They both rose without a sound and sat right beside my chair. It was obvious that they were nervous too. Now, they kept glancing around them, looking towards the trees and across the meadow. And there were no more sounds for the next, half hour or so. The dogs had settled down and were now sleeping by my feet. I got up and I poured some water over the remaining coals and made sure everything was put away for the night. The dogs and I were settled into our tent when I heard a loud noise in the forest behind us. It sounded like someone hitting a tree with a big stick. Just whack, 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 3 times in a row. My heart leaped into my throat at the sound, and the dogs were shaking. I jumped out of my sleeping bag. I threw on my clothes. The dogs and I quickly retreated to my vehicle, where I felt safer behind the closed and locked doors of my truck rather than the soft sides of the tent. Well, after about an hour or so of sitting in the truck, I kind of decided it must be the sound of a deer whacking their antlers on the trees or something benign. So I remembered watching 2 bull elk clash their antlers together once and the tremendous sound it had made. I figured it must have just been something like that, and I was just getting very sleepy. Bravely, I woke the dogs, and we all went back to the tent. I had finally fallen asleep when I was awoken by what sounded like pebbles being thrown onto my tent. At first, I thought it was hailing, but it was more sporadic than that, and there was not the customary smell that precedes or follows the rain shower. So I unzipped the tent and confirmed that there was no rain and no hail. I shone my flashlight around the outside of my tent, which of course did not shine very far in the night and really only scared me more because of the shadowy shapes of the trees and the bushes. I thought I heard something running away and decided it must be a raccoon or a coyote. It didn't sound terribly loud, so I was pretty sure it wasn't a bear. I contemplated getting back into the truck, but decided I was letting my imagination get the best of me, so I climbed back into my tent, zipped it up, got back into my warm sleeping bag. I just drifted back to sleep when I was jolted awake by the feeling of my tent being pulled, as if someone or something was trying to scoot it across the ground. My dogs growled and I heard something scurry away quickly. Now, you gotta understand that my 2 dogs were not the type to bark or chase anything or alert to wild animals, whether they were bears, coyotes, or whatever. They looked to me to protect them rather than the other way around. So to hear them growl really told me that something was seriously wrong. I immediately rushed out of my tent and ran to the truck, my 2 dogs running ahead of me and leaping into the truck as soon as I opened the door. Now I was petrified with fear. I would have driven away, but I didn't want to leave all my camping gear. So I locked the truck doors and sat awake, staring into the darkness, straining my eyes. I imagined all kinds of things, eyes staring back at me, movements in the shadows. I was staring straight ahead when all of a sudden a rock hit the window. I let out a terrified scream, threw my head back as if that rock was coming right through the glass and hit me in the face. It actually would have hit me in the face had the glass not been there. Suddenly I heard several rocks pelting the side of the truck and the windshield. Whatever was out there, it was now attacking my truck. I reached down for the keys, wanting to get the heck out of there, and realized the keys were not in the ignition. I didn't remember removing them, so I knew I must have dropped them on the floorboard. I reached down, feeling with my fingers for the keys, but I couldn't find them. Now I sat back up and I grabbed my phone to turn the flashlight on, and that's when I saw that face looking at me through the passenger side window. The eyes were dark, and the face was huge and hairy. It turned away when it saw me. This all happened so fast that my mind just couldn't process it. I actually thought I'd just imagined seeing that thing in the window. I got my phone light on and flashed it towards the window, but of course nothing was there. I flashed it on the floorboard and found my keys, quickly putting them in the ignition, and just as the truck roared to life, I felt something leap into the bed of the truck. I stepped on the gas, throwing out rocks and debris from under my tires as I put my truck into motion. Whatever it was that jumped onto the bed of my truck fell backwards, and in my rearview mirror I could see the shape of something large and furry in the back. It was still there. The road to the campsite was deeply rutted, and I was taking it much too fast. I could see in the rearview mirror that this big furry or hairy thing was holding on to the sides of the truck, and it was standing up. But as my truck hit a particularly large rock on the passenger side of the vehicle, The truck lunged and whatever was on the back of the truck fell plumb off. I kept driving, not the least bit worried about the underside of my truck. I was only being careful not to hit a tree or a boulder or a hole big enough to stop the truck. Finally, I made it to the dirt road that led away from the four-wheel drive Jeep road that I'd been camped on. I drove all the way home to Lake Tahoe, leaving my camping gear behind. The following weekend, I got up the nerve to go back and retrieve my camping gear, if it was still there. I asked a friend of mine to go with me. We didn't intend on camping, just gather up my gear and head on back home. Well, my friend Danny, he was surprised I left my gear back at the campsite. He knew that I was an avid camper and backpacker, and I was not the kind of person to walk away, leaving my things behind. Now, I hadn't told him what I had seen or heard because it just sounded too fantastic. I didn't really believe it myself. I thought my imagination, which had always been very healthy, had just taken over, and I knew Danny wouldn't go with me if I told him the truth. Now, it was early afternoon when we arrived at the campsite. Considering the condition of the road, I was surprised that I hadn't damaged my truck by driving it so fast the last time I had been on it. I had plenty of new scratches and dents, but apparently I hadn't damaged the undercarriage too severely. When we reached the site where I'd camped, my tent was still there, but it had been torn to shreds. My sleeping bag was lying in a heap several yards away. My camp chair had been thrown up into a nearby tree and was hanging from a branch way above our heads. The other few miscellaneous things I had left behind were all missing. Danny was sure a bear had destroyed my camp, but I clearly remembered the sight of that large, hairy thing standing in the bed of my truck, and the face that had appeared in the window. It was definitely not a bear's face or any other creature I could identify. Was it a Bigfoot? Well, that's the only explanation that makes any sense to me. One thing's for certain, though. I haven't returned to that particular campsite. Oh, I still go camping, but I tend to pick areas with at least a few other people around, just in case. Now, that was an interesting story. I don't know what I'd have done if something like that happened to me while I was camping out there, especially if you were unarmed and unprepared for something that wild and that big, hairy. But I know one thing, I'd have probably left that campsite too. There ain't no sense in hanging around in their environment when they don't want you there. Well, I got another one for you. Just heard this one. This is a story from Rusty Miller's book, Bigfoot Campfire Stories. It's really kind of interesting for Ginger because she's traveled that stretch of river by train several times. It's a little personal to her. It's the Green River Ghost. You know where the Green River is, over Utah way. Well, my name is Jeb. I'm a retired engineer on the railroad. I'd like to tell you a little story about an unusual thing that happened to me one frosty night on my run between Grand Junction, Colorado, and Helper, Utah. Specifically, this happened to me in Green River, Utah, about midway through the run. It's not a long or spectacular story, but it's one that still causes me to wonder what I hit that cold November night. We had a long train that night. We were carrying coal. I don't recall how many cars we had, but we'd picked up from Grand Junction. We were headed west, coal that had come up through Delta from those mines over near Paonia. I remember it being an unusually long train, and we had 2 engines on the front and 2 helper engines on the back. I was glad I didn't have to take it up over Soldier Summit, as I knew it would be a long, slow night for that engineer. Instead, I would be in bed in Price, Utah at the end of my run. Nothing unusual happened as we dragged all that coal out of Junction, on through Ruby and Horse Thief Canyons along the Colorado River, and then on up the Adobe Hills into Cisco, Thompson Springs, and then on past Floy as we got closer to Green River. I always enjoyed going through Green River. It's a little desert town that reminds me of Roger Miller's song, King of the Road. It just kind of seems like it was stuck in the 60s. I always liked to slow down a bit when we were coming around that big sweep that goes under the highway there on the east side of town, because I knew we'd soon be crossing a road with no railroad signal. I didn't want to run into anybody. And the last time I was there, that road out to the little airport, it still had no signal. You just looked both ways and then drove like hell, hoping no trains were coming. Just after the big sweep and before the train reached that crossing, the old train station, you crossed over the old bridge across the Green River. They're right there by the golf course. Used to be an old river meander. That railroad bridge has been there for many years and still going strong. So I guess it was about 2 a.m. and I'd hit the brakes just a bit to slow her down just as we came around that big old sweep. Now it takes a hell of a lot to slow that big coal train down, so my braking was more a matter of my own psychology than reality. I'd like to feel things were a little safer, but they probably weren't. I couldn't have stopped that train on a dime if someone's life depended on it, which I would soon find out. We came on into the sweep, and I could see the lights of town to my right, where there's a strip of motels. Now the sweep straightened out just in time to cross the bridge, a classic old structure with several metal spans, the kind you see in the old vintage railroad movies. And just as we straightened out, I could see something walking on the tracks ahead, going away from me, something large, and was right in the middle of that bridge. I hit the panic button and the brakes, but there was no way in hell I could stop in time. I also got on the whistle. The train came upon that thing quickly, and I could make out a very large figure that looked like a football player. It had huge shoulders, massive head. It looked human, but somehow not. I was on it fast. It stopped and turned towards the train, and I could see a huge dark face with dark eyes. I felt sick as the engine hit it. I hoped it wasn't human, and I didn't think so, because it felt more like we'd hit a large bull. Yet it seemed to be something upright and walking, and with that face seemed intelligent, what I could see of it. We hit it straight on, and there was nowhere for it to go on that bridge, no place to step off to the side. I felt it, and I was sick. I've unfortunately hit deer and elk, and only a big bull elk would be even close to that kind of impact. My brakeman came up and asked me what was going on. I told him. I called the guy in the helper engine, told him what was happening to watch and see what we'd hit. I then radioed headquarters, all the time trying to stop that damn train. I didn't get it stopped for a good 3/4 mile, way out beyond the town into the desert. Headquarters radioed that they'd stopped all the traffic and that I was to back up and stop in town at that old station and wait. The sheriff would be there to meet me, so I did. It took a while to get that train backed up, and I realized as I was backing that this would put the back part of the train right back on the bridge. I didn't want to do that. It needed to be left clear so we could see what had happened, if anything was there. So I radioed back to headquarters and got permission to stop out of town and wait. We sat there all night, what was left of it, stopping all railroad traffic while the sheriff investigated. We couldn't get out and go anywhere because it would have been a long walk in the desert, no roads, and just a few deep arroyos to cross, so we just sat there in the train. We finally got word to back up onto the siding there where the sheriff could examine the front of the train, and that we would soon need to be on our way as we were holding everything up, so that's what we did. And by now it was early morning. I got out and met the sheriff, and we examined the front end of the train. Now, it had a big dent, which is hard to do to a train engine. He told me that they hadn't been able to find any sign of anything or anyone. Whatever it was had to have been tossed out into the river. They'd searched all around the bridge abutments and everywhere, no luck, and he had sent some guys down the river in a boat to look. But except for the dent in the engine, we had nothing. We were then given instructions to proceed, so we did, and I switched out in helper, and my wife picked me up, and I went home to Price. I didn't figure I'd ever know what I'd hit, but it sure as hell traumatized me. I wanted to quit. I didn't think I could ever forget seeing that figure coming into my lights and the look on its face just before I hit it. Well, I had to make a report, and I just said it looked like something big, like a big bull. I didn't mention the upright stance or that face. People would think I was crazy. There's no face on this planet that big. The railroad gave me a leave of absence when I asked for it, and I took 2 weeks and went up to Schofield Reservoir and fished. That seemed to do the trick. I started feeling human again. I was soon back to work. But every time I crossed that damn bridge, I had to distract myself and look out at the water or at the motel lights, because I would think I could see its face. That would really get to me. And finally one night, about a year after the accident, I decided to just deal with it, to face my fears head on and just go across the bridge without thinking about it. So when I got close to Green River, I just looked straight on and I could finally see that silver metal bridge glowing in the moonlight. I just kept with it, watching. I was determined to just get over this thing. As the train came over the bridge, I'll be go to heck if it wasn't there again. Everything was just like on that night before. I hit the brakes and panicked and hit the whistle, bracing for the impact. But there wasn't any impact. Nothing. The brakeman came up, asked me what was going on, and I decided to tell him. He asked me if I'd been drinking, but he knew I was damn serious. He just shook his head and wrote it off to having a flashback. Said he'd keep it between the two of us. Now I was shook up. I kept on going, and when I got to help her, I told my wife all about it. She was concerned and told me I needed some time off. Anyways, to make a long story short, this happened to me every time I went across that damn bridge. And I knew it was the ghost of that thing I'd killed. I spent many hours actually crying over that whole incident and got to where I was afraid it would somehow follow me home. I asked for a new route, and there weren't any available, so I finally just took an early retirement. And I'll be damned if the brakeman didn't call me one day and tell me that he'd seen it himself. And I've even heard a few stories about the guys playing golf there. When they get to the part of the course that's next to the bridge and it's late evening, they see things. So I know it wasn't just my overactive imagination. I just hope it never comes up this way. Well, that's kind of a cute little story. Kind of something that'd stay with you, wouldn't it? Nobody wants to do that. Well, something to think about. Sober you up a little. Well, if that's the case, let's have some more of that coffee. Give me some of that whiskey, go with it, and we'll tell another story. And if you're not around for that one, I'll see you the next time. Until then, this is Clay Steele. Good night.